One of the things we know about hormones is that they work together in symphony, right? And so there's a feedback mechanism between thyroid hormones and cortisol. So when we have low levels of thyroid hormones, our cortisol is going to sort of counteract to counterbalance. And so we're going to have a little bit of higher levels of cortisol.
Hey, this is Ari. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. With me today is Dr. Isabella Wentz, who is a personal friend of mine and actually one of the first guests on this podcast 5 years ago, all the way back in 2017. She's an internationally acclaimed thyroid specialist and licensed pharmacist who has dedicated her career to addressing the root causes of autoimmune thyroid disease after being diagnosed with it herself in 2009. She's the author of 3 books on Hashimoto's thyroiditis lifestyle interventions for finding and treating the root cause, Hashimoto's food pharmacology, and Hashimoto's protocol, which became a #1 New York Times bestseller. She currently lives in Texas with her husband, Michael, also a good friend of mine, and their son, who's very cute, Dimitri, very cute, and also a source of Isabella's sleep deprivation for many years now. So as she will talk about in this interview, she's also the author of the new book, The Adrenal Transformation Protocol, which is the subject of today's episode. So with no further ado, enjoy the episode.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I was curious. I just looked this up because I remembered you were one of the very first guests I ever had on the podcast. And you were last on my podcast in 2017.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It's been a while.
It has been a long time. So let's just jump straight into this. So you have a new book that is coming out when exactly?
It's coming out on April 18th, and it's called The Adrenal Transformation Protocol.
Amazing.
ATP
Okay.
for short.
ATP. Oh, that's very nice. Very nice double meaning there. As a mitochondria guy, I have to love that. Okay, so tell me how you developed this. Why did this come about? Being and it's somewhat off-brand. It's somewhat outside of your niche. Somewhat, obviously related, overlapping, lots of overlap. But you're the thyroid pharmacist. That is your brand. How are you now talking about the adrenals?
I mean, you really can't help the thyroid without addressing the health of our adrenals. So this is such a common pattern that I've seen in people with Hashimoto's. Just going through their symptoms and looking at their labs, about 90% of them have alterations in how much cortisol they release throughout the day. They've got all the symptoms. So they're feeling brain fogged, they're feeling fatigued, they're struggling with sleep issues. So they're tired throughout their day, they're wired at nighttime, they can't fall asleep. And so even when they're on thyroid medications, and in fact, sometimes thyroid medications can exacerbate these issues because thyroid medications can actually cause more cortisol to be.
I don't know what happened there, but you froze as you were talking about even while they're on thyroid medication. And then you were going into the explanation of why it still happens while on thyroid medication, which is actually something I've always wondered about, because I have heard that many times where somebody will report that even very small doses of thyroid hormones will really exacerbate their symptoms, cause anxiety, insomnia, things like that.
So one of the things we know about hormones is that they work together in symphony, right? And so there's a feedback mechanism between thyroid hormones and cortisol. So when we have low levels of thyroid hormones, our cortisol is going to sort of counteract to counterbalance. And so we're going to have a little bit of higher levels of cortisol. Once we get on replacement thyroid hormone, the cortisol clearance is actually going to increase. And so we're going to have lower levels of cortisol when we get on thyroid meds. And for people with conditions like Addison's that are true adrenals cannot produce enough cortisol, it's actually contraindicated to start on thyroid hormones until we get on cortisol replacement, just to make sure that we're not really clearing out that cortisol, because that can be a dangerous situation in the case of Addison's. And in the case of most people that I see with Hashimoto's and people with adrenal issues, basically what's going to happen is you have a falsely elevated cortisol when you don't have enough thyroid hormone on board, but you bring it on board and that cortisol just escapes, gets cleared out pretty quickly. And that can cause a lot of symptoms. People will say, oh my gosh, I started on thyroid meds and I was so excited because I thought this was going to be the answer to everything, right? And I felt better for a little bit. And then all of a sudden my fatigue came back, and it came back with a vengeance. And what is happening, right? That's it.
Got it. Okay, so let's talk adrenals. And I want to get into depth with you here. Perhaps greater depth than you would get in with other podcast interviews, because I think you know that I've spent a lot of time on this topic, and I've spent a lot of time debunking notions of adrenal fatigue, and I've spent probably a good few thousand hours digging into the literature on adrenal function, cortisol levels, HPA axis function in relation to various chronic stressors and in relationship to chronic fatigue in particular. I have to imagine there isn't more than a handful of people who have spent more time on that literature than in the world than I have. So I know a thing or two about it. There's also a lot of misconception in this area. So for decades, we had everybody in the functional medicine, the natural health, alternative health communities, everybody believed in adrenal fatigue. To question that was heresy. And you were a crazy person. You were outcasted from the in-group of natural health people and functional medicine people if you dared to question the adrenal fatigue dogma. Now, in the last few years, the tides have turned a little bit. And in 2016, there was a paper, a review of the literature titled "Adrenal Fatigue Does Not Exist." And that one also went a long way, I think, to debunking this adrenal fatigue narrative. But let's go broad with your answer. So what exactly is sort of your current paradigm around adrenal dysfunction and how it relates to stress-related symptoms?
So absolutely. And I know when I was first diagnosed with Hashimoto's, I heard about adrenal fatigue, and it was like a quack diagnosis and it didn't exist. And so yet I tried some of the things that were recommended for adrenal fatigue, and then they helped. And so I think both things can be true. It's not what the old school naturopathic doctors are saying. It is your poor little adrenals aren't just like feeling tired, right? And they're not feeling lazy. And they are capable of producing the right hormones in the right amounts, right? They're perfectly capable of doing that. But because of how we're responding to stress, because our body tends to respond to whatever stress is out there in a similar fashion, that's what's going on. And so we need to address our stress response. And, you know, I say stress, and it's not just like somebody yelling at you and being mean. Stress can come from internal sources. It can come from chronic infections. It can come from toxins, so on and so forth. So what I typically think about, it's not just like, oh, you're just a little bit stressed and you have adrenal fatigue and you need to get on these you just need to really improve your lifestyle, because that may help a little bit, but we really do need to go oftentimes a bit deeper to uncover, why is your body feeling like it is under so much stress? So what is currently happening in your lifestyle where your body feels like it needs to protect itself? Like adrenal fatigue, quote unquote, or just that impaired stress response, I feel like it can be a very protective mechanism for the body when it is feeling like something in the environment or within our body is not safe. That's kind of my overarching like big picture view of that, right? So the adrenals aren't damaged. They're capable of producing the right amount of hormones. Mm-hmm. And typically what I see in people with thyroid issues is that they have low levels of cortisol throughout the day. And it's not because they have Addison's disease. A lot of it has to do with their lifestyle and whatever else is going on physiologically with them. Okay,
so let's talk more about that. I was going to ask you to get into some specifics of what exactly the adrenal abnormalities are. That's a good insight into it. Obviously, there's this thing called HPA axis dysfunction, and I think there's various different things that might fall under that umbrella term. So One of them is an abnormal diurnal curve of cortisol. We're supposed to have high levels in the morning, and then it's supposed to decline throughout the day into the night where it's supposed to be low. And one thing that someone can have is too low of levels in the morning and too high of levels in the evening. So they might maybe struggle to get energized in the morning, and they might have too much energy and racing thoughts and anxiety and have difficulty sleeping at night. Another thing would be what you're talking about, where somebody's just sort of more chronically low, and it will be worth digging into that. If it's not this narrative of adrenal fatigue, these poor little adrenal glands are getting worn out from the chronic stress, now they can't produce enough cortisol. What is causing that? I want to get into that in a second. And I think the vast majority of the literature on chronic stressors of various types, whether we're talking about work stress or financial stress or relationship stress or any other even physical stressors of various kinds, even metabolic stressors, like some people who have diabetes, people who are chronic cigarette smokers, alcohol consumers. I've looked at all that literature on and how it relates to cortisol levels. And almost without exception, almost every category you look at, the people who have chronic metabolic stress, so as an example, people with high job stress versus low job stress, smoke lots of cigarettes, people who smoke lots of cigarettes versus people who don't smoke or smoke very few, people who drink a lot versus people who drink much less or not at all. Almost without exception, every category you look at, people with more of that stress have higher levels of cortisol than people who don't, which is exactly the opposite of what the adrenal fatigue hypothesis would predict. It would predict that all these various kinds of chronic stressors would be associated with lower levels of cortisol, but they're not. They're associated with higher. So what you're seeing in this subset of people that you're dealing with is more often than not this chronic low level of cortisol.
Yeah, I've tested hundreds of people with like the adrenal saliva tests, and it's been I used to use this test that is no longer available, but the test was so accurate. I could just essentially look at the test and describe the person's symptom to them, and they would say, okay, yes, this matches exactly. And so 90% of my people, close to 90%, would have low levels of cortisol, what I like to call basically a flatlined adrenal curve, where, like you said, it's supposed to start off with high cortisol in the morning. You get this cortisol kick, you jump out of bed, you're excited, life is good. And then you, throughout the day, you get a little bit more tired, and at nighttime you have no cortisol and you drift off into bed and have beautiful dreams, right? Most people would have kind of, oh man, I'm barely getting out of bed. I'm barely trudging by. I feel a little bit anxious here. And then towards the end of the day, like I get this like extra little kick where you look at their evening cortisol and their morning cortisol, and they're almost like the same. So obviously, they're not going to be much more tired than they should be. And so what I've noticed is that typically people will start off, and the people that had newer diagnosed or had thyroid issues for shorter, they tended to have higher cortisol levels. So they would have that cortisol pattern that's described in the literature. We hear a lot about like a lot of cortisol is bad. Having too much cortisol is bad, right? And so what we know is cortisol is you need to have just the right amounts of it. Like too much is not good, but not enough is not good. Now, cortisol can be very, I guess, damaging to the body, for lack of a better word. So when we have cortisol, basically it tells our body that we are, we're in survival mode here. Let's not repair our body. Let's break it down because we need to produce more cortisol. People, come on, get it done, right? And so typically that's how it starts off. But then the longer you're in like under that stress, eventually your body is going to say, this is just unrealistic. It's like the boy that cried wolf. Like you can't be in a high cortisol all the time. So even when you are stressed out, your body's not going to produce as much. And so your body, to protect itself, will downregulate the cortisol production. And this is typically what I see in people with thyroid issues, when they've had thyroid issues for a long time and they end up with they initially will be very, very stressed out. And essentially they burn out towards the end where their body's like, I'm not listening to you. Like, yeah, they're stressed, but we can't have this much cortisol happening all the time, right? And so this is what I've seen in my experience is just basically the brain, the HPA axis that just is like, nope, we're not doing that.
Okay, so this is interesting. So this is I just want to maybe touch on a couple nuances. So true Addison's disease is the actual inability of the adrenal glands to produce enough cortisol. You've got the brain producing this hormone ACTH that is basically screaming at the adrenals to produce more cortisol. And what you see in that is high ACTH levels and low cortisol levels. So the brain is saying, we need more cortisol. The adrenal glands can't produce it. That's true adrenal insufficiency, Addison's disease. What you're saying is that these people have adrenal glands that are still perfectly capable of producing enough cortisol, but there is an adaptive thing that is occurring in response to chronic stress, where you're saying the body is basically pulling back on cortisol. It's sort of pumping the brakes in a way and saying like, calm down, you need to relax. Like we need more rest, less, stress mode, less go mode. If I'm catching you correct, is that accurate to frame it the way I said there?
Yep. You explained it really well.
Okay. So there's one more aspect of this that I wanted to elaborate on, which is, okay, so if that's the case, have you done 24-hour total cortisol measurements on these people? Have you determined whether they are actually producing normal amounts of cortisol over a 24-hour period and it's more of a flat diurnal curve, or is it truly low cortisol output over a 24-hour period?
The only tests that I've done were tests like the Dutch test, which uses urine, and then the saliva tests. So it's not something that I would do, hook up somebody to like a measuring tool for 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
But typically the patterns, what I would see in people that would describe symptoms of fatigue and symptoms of brain fog.
Okay, so but in particular, do you see a big drop in morning cortisol levels? It's where you really identify that these people aren't getting this big peak like they should be having in the mornings. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, and I would say majority, and of course I have had some people that had high cortisol all throughout the day, but the majority of people with hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, they did present with that way where they just had a tough time getting up in the morning, and sure enough, their cortisol levels were low at that time.
Okay. Have you, I'm sure you must have stumbled across the literature on being a night owl chronotype in relationship to this story. I of all the different factors that I looked into, I found that one to be the most impressive as far as the magnitude of how much of an impact it had on morning cortisol levels in relationship, even in healthy people with no symptoms. Just whether somebody was a morning person or a night owl could predict massive differences in morning cortisol levels. Have you seen any of those studies?
I've looked at a lot of studies on why people have a hard time getting up in the morning and what's happening. And there's a different kind of shift where, for whatever reason, your circadian rhythm is not aligned to, it's not aligned to essentially the sun. It might be aligned to more of like the moon cycles. And so you tend to be like a night owl, right? You're more of a werewolf than you are a human, because you're more aligned with those kind of cycles.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't sound good for a diurnal animal. Sounds like that might be optimal for a nocturnal animal, but not so much for the human species.
Right. But I think there's actually a way to reset it. And so I know I used to think I was a night owl, and I used to think that was who I was, and I'm a morning person. And I know part of the reason, and you and I have talked about this, and why I kind of had some new revelations about how do you actually not have trouble waking up in the morning? How do you have energy throughout the day? How do you deal with the brain fog? Was as occurred, and thanks to my sweet son who who didn't sleep for a very, very long time, and that meant I didn't sleep. So I was essentially a night owl because I had to be up at night taking care of him, and I'd have trouble waking up in the morning. And at that time I had this thought like, okay, I can't quit caffeine, I can't sleep at night, I can't do all these things, and how do I stay healthy? And this is sort of where some of the new insights about adrenals came to my head, and energy production and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there was a study published in the journal Nature maybe 7 or 8 years ago. It's one of my favorite studies, and because it's so primitive, the intervention they did, they basically took a bunch of self-proclaimed night owls and they put them on a camping trip essentially, with no artificial light, and all these people who normally went to bed at 1 or 2 a.m. and professed, just swore up and down, I'm a night owl. I've always been a night owl. This is just how I'm wired. My natural bedtime is 1 or 2 a.m. And all of a sudden, within less than a week, they started going to bed at 9:30 or 10 p.m. and waking up naturally without an alarm clock at 6 or 6:30 a.m. And what we can extrapolate from that research is that the night owl chronotype is largely, of course, there is a genetic component. Some people are more true night owls than others. But I would go so far as to say that the vast majority of people who believe that they're night owls are not actually night owls, but have just been programmed as such by modern society and modern artificial lighting and that sort of thing.
It's such a pedestrian recommendation, but one of the things that I recommend actually to help you get more energy in the morning is like step outside and get some sunshine, like first thing in the morning. And I know it's much easier when you live in like Costa Rica or Los Angeles or Texas. When I lived in the Netherlands and when I lived in Chicago and even when I lived in Boulder, that wasn't as easy to do, of course. But just getting bright light therapy is going to, like you said, on a camping trip where you have access to a tent. So you're going to be outside in the bright lights of natural lighting throughout the day. You're going to have more energy throughout the day naturally. And because you don't have blue lights and you don't have, hopefully you didn't bring your cell phone and your laptop on the camping trip, but you're going to have an easier time falling asleep at night when it's naturally dark. And those are just like those are simple things that people can do. I know when I lived in a different climate, I would use like a bright light therapy box. So people can definitely still have access to that, even if they live in, Alaska and not close to the equator, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what are some of the key symptoms that you see associated with this? Like subjectively, how would someone listening to this know that they fall into this category of people with adrenal dysfunction like you're describing? Is it something they have to go get their cortisol tested, or subjectively, do you find that there are symptoms that are really specific to this kind of adrenal dysfunction that don't have massive overlap with lots of other like possible explanations as to what their symptoms could be caused by?
So that's a good question. And I think adrenal dysfunction, HPA dysfunction is probably the more accurate term, is kind of that how the body reacts to stress, right? And so you have this cluster of symptoms, and it's convenient to have a name for them, right? Maybe it's not always the most accurate name, but it makes sense when you have fatigue, especially trouble waking up in the morning, chronic fatigue throughout the day. You might feel more wired and tired. You might feel a bit moody throughout the day. So maybe after lunch, you might have the 3 o'clock afternoon slump where you just want to take a nap. You might kind of feel anxious throughout the day. You might have trouble falling asleep and having a racy mind. Having brain fog and memory issues is common. Feeling like overwhelmed, I would say, is going to be like a big cardinal sign for me. You're just like, oh my gosh, not one more thing. And basically like doing really doing very basic household things tends to be overwhelming. Somebody calls to say hi and you're like, oh, no, what do they want from me? And just kind of feeling on edge at all times is kind of the way that people describe being in this state.
I feel like you're describing like 98% of Americans.
Pretty much, it's true. um, and it's you say that, and it's very interesting because I have a lot of girlfriends from high school that would reach out to me after I published my books on Hashimoto's, and they'd look at some of the symptoms and look at some of my blogs, and they're like, but I'm overwhelmed, I'm anxious, I have, I've put on some extra weight, I have libido issues, I can't sleep at night, like I don't have Hashimoto's though, like, can you help me? And a lot of it is like, yeah, it's like a lifestyle change. Let's rewire your stress response. Let's rewire your circadian rhythm. And then you're going to feel better when you're going to have more energy when you're supposed to. You're going to sleep better at night. Your body's going to recover much better. So I do think it is a chronic thing. Many of us in today's society are exposed to these stressors, and I always say, like, we're cave people living in a modern world with our cave man and cave women genes, and all these things are telling our cave genes that something's off, right? So like, when would a caveman have lights on all night, like if he was keeping watch on something, right? Like if something dangerous was going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've spent actually over a long time, but I've gone on another little deep dive on this lately, watching videos on hunter-gatherer tribes. A lot of people don't realize there are still hunter-gatherer tribes that exist in the world today. It's not just this thing that existed 10,000 years ago. There are still in Africa, in South America, in certain other parts of the world, these tribes still exist. This is a bit of a digression, but I can't resist. There's a really interesting island, kind of off the coast of India, off the coast of the Andaman Islands, called Sentinel Island, and it is it's considered the last uncontacted tribe in the world. And there's a really interesting video on YouTube, like 30-minute long video that was just published a few weeks ago, where it's titled something like "Going to this island will kill you," and basically, to make a very long story short, most attempts to make contact with this tribe have resulted in the tribe coming out with bows and arrows and shooting at anybody who approaches the island, or if somebody lands there, like some boats, fishermen, and one Christian missionary a few years ago who went there to try to convert them to Christianity. Almost everybody is killed. And so these people still exist there in the same way that they've existed for tens of thousands of years. And they have no contact with all of the buildings and technologies and cars and planes and internet and computers and that exists just 30 miles away from them on the Andaman Islands or off the coast of India. It's very interesting. But the point of this is to say that when you watch videos on hunter-gatherer lifestyles, you realize that their existence is pretty low stress, especially psychologically. It's far, far, far lower stress than modern humans. They live, relatively speaking, they live a very leisurely lifestyle. There's a lot of kind of lounging around, of just hanging out and not doing a whole lot. And, maybe you're tending to the kids, you're fetching water, you're cooking, you're eating, you're going on a hunt, whatever the case may be, but lots of lounging and a pretty chill, relaxed existence. If you ask them what is the meaning of life, or what is happiness, like what gives you happiness, like you ask them to explain how they derive happiness, they'll say things like, having a successful hunt is happiness. Getting meat for my tribe, my family, is happiness. It's very simple. It's a very simple blueprint for happiness, whereas us modern humans have this sort of endless complexity around these questions, a level of infinite complexity that makes it almost impossible to achieve these states.
Like a happiness flow chart that you need to have all of these different points met, right?
Yeah, exactly. So and we're, constantly go, go, go. We've got the whole keeping up with the Joneses culture. We got the hustle and grind, workaholic type culture, super materialistic culture. We have it's a very superficial culture as far as how we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people. And all of that leads to a very high baseline level of stress and anxiety in our lives that I think humans are not really wired for, biologically speaking, when we examine our ancestors' way of life, our ancestral way of life. How much do you think that plays a role in this whole thing, this sort of like the way that modern culture and society is?
I think it's a huge stressor for sure. So you've got like TV and it's programming you and telling you that something dangerous happened. There's like the Nextdoor app that tells you about something happening in your neighborhood. Somebody got shot or you had a fire. And it's just like all this information that's letting your body know that you're not safe. You feel like this need to constantly be productive. So whether that is working on your side hustle or doing this or going shopping or doing, all this maintenance, and you've got emails to check and so on and so forth. Like, I think we should all be ladies and gentlemen of leisure, right? One of the things I recommend throughout my book is to actually give yourself opportunities to enjoy life and just enjoy the simple pleasures of life. Find ways to boost your, oxytocin levels through being with other people and bonding with other people, creating just for fun. So I know a lot of times you're good at something and you end up turning it into a job, right? So you're a really good writer and you end up writing books, and now you become stressed out because you have all these book deadlines, or maybe I'm just talking about myself, right? But but then there's other things we can do that are just for fun, and that just clears our mind, that just makes us really present in the moment, and having those opportunities throughout the day, not just when we go on vacation for 2 weeks, right? And we unplug, but just doing that mindfully throughout the day, every day, just little doses of that's going to send a nice safety signal to the body to let you know that no, we're not like in a famine. We don't have to produce all these stress hormones. We don't have to downregulate. Like we can reboot and we can rebalance. I do think just the psychological stress component of everything that's going on, especially in the last few years with the war, the pandemic, the various people having their rights have changed, and it's just stressful. Like one of the things I recommend actually is turning off the TV much as you possibly can, especially any kind of news channel, tuning that out, because a lot of times those messages are just like putting our they're hijacking our bodies. It's like an amygdala hijack where you're like, oh no, am I in danger? Am I in danger? And that's stressful for the body, right?
This pattern of lowered cortisol, seen as kind of an intelligent, adaptive way that the body is sort of responding to a state of chronic stress, as this, like we talked about earlier, kind of this way of saying, of kind of pulling back and saying, hey, I'm overwhelmed, there's too much chronic stress, let's tone things down. How does that actually work physiologically? Like, what do you have any sense of like what is going on as far as how lower levels of cortisol are translating into protection for that person? Like what like, and I don't mean necessarily like the biochemistry of this, but like what is sort of the big picture of that? How is it adaptive? How is it helping that person?
So I love talking about the big picture. When we have, let's say if you were indeed in a famine or in a war or in a situation that was unfriendly, what would be the best way to survive, right? Would it be to go outside and, run around and be a go-getter and interact with lots of people? Probably not. it probably would be to like retreat back in your cave and sit on your couch and like sleep as much as you can, conserve your energy, maybe hold on to some weight so that you don't have to go out and hunt every single day. And so it is a way for the body to be protective, to pull back from, whatever danger is going outside. So you typically have a person that's chronically fatigued. You're just not doing much. You're kind of hanging back in your house and just avoiding things, right? And so that can be protective, right? If there was something dangerous going on outside of your home, just staying inside in your bed, going to keep you safe.
Totally. There's, I think from this perspective, you can see cortisol as sort of like action hormone, like motivating the person to get up and go into action, to go do stuff in the world. There's one interesting study that I remember from when I spent several years doing all this review of all these studies on cortisol and chronic stress and chronic fatigue. It's a super interesting study. It's kind of obscure. I've never heard anybody else talk about it, as you probably have never seen it, but it looked at morning cortisol levels in the same individuals on work days versus non-work days.
And I bet on work days, they just did not want to get out of bed, or
No, the opposite. On work days, they had higher levels of cortisol, and on non-work days, they had lower levels.
Interesting.
And and that would be what you expect in a healthy person, right? That they should, on a day where they feel some psychological pressure to go out and get stuff done, they've got to go get ready, they've got to go to work, they've got to be productive, the pressure is on, cortisol is elevated. And then on non-work days, it was like almost cut in half when they didn't have pressure, when they got to just hang out and chill. And what you're talking about is somewhat different, because that's a healthy person context, and that's describing healthy responses. What you're talking about is sort of this pattern of, well, what happens if you're chronically overwhelmed with too much stressors? Now the body is using the lowered cortisol to sort of pull you back from engagement and action, and saying like, no, you've got too much going on, dude. Let's tone it back, or dude or dudette, I should say. And let's calm down, let's pull the brakes a little bit, and let's try to relax a little bit more and not be in go mode so much.
Interesting, the pattern that I see, and it's not through measuring cortisol, but just what people have described, especially ones that don't like their jobs, is like, and I just dread getting out of bed in the morning, and then on the weekends I just get right up. Or if they're on vacation, they're like, and I jump out of bed in the morning every day. And that, that just goes to show, it's like, well, what is it about your lifestyle that is bringing you so much stress?
Right. And, as humans, we also need to be careful not to reduce everything down to assuming our whole subjective state is, being controlled by one particular hormone, or one like particular neurotransmitter. Oh, you're depressed. Oh, you need to take this serotonin boosting substance. Oh, you're lacking energy. It means you've got, low cortisol levels or whatever. Like what the situation you're describing is, I would say, much deeper and more complicated, in the sense of humans need lots of things to be like happy, in a good mood, and highly energetic and motivated and focused and productive, and for their brain and body to produce lots of energy. We need good nutrition, we need good sleep, we need good circadian rhythm, we need exercise, we need good hormonal rhythms, good neurotransmitter levels to be providing the precursors of all these different neurotransmitters. We need community and social support. We need to be aligned with, like, working towards something that we are working in, something that we are passionate about and we enjoy, and working towards something that we find purpose and meaning in. And when you start removing pieces of that, and somebody even ignoring all the biochemistry stuff of health, but just say, let's take somebody and socially isolate them instead of allowing them to be with their family or community. Let's take somebody who is super passionate about music and stick them in a customer service or tech job doing work that they hate every day. Like you're going to have a very complex psycho-spiritual, emotional response to that as a human being, and which will also be correlated with certain neurotransmitter and hormonal profiles that are related to those symptoms that you're experiencing. But subjectively, I mean, for me, if I was asked to do a job every day that I didn't like, I mean, my life, my happiness level, my mood, my energy level would all be dramatically different from what they are,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we talked about circadian rhythm earlier, and given that cortisol is a hormone that is very strongly tied to the circadian rhythm, and we talked about chronotypes and how much that impacts the story. Where would you sort of rank, as you're looking to fix this problem and fix these symptoms that you've described, where would you rank the importance of circadian rhythm and sleep in this sort of hierarchy of priorities of what people need to work on to fix these issues?
I mean, that would be a top priority. So one of the fastest ways to get your cortisol low or to get into HPA axis dysfunction is through sleep deprivation, right? And so one of the best ways to get out of it is going to be making sure that you are getting adequate sleep. And so part of that is like you said, it's aligning with the natural rhythms and making sure you get plenty of bright lights throughout the day. You're eating food throughout the day. You're eating, I typically like to recommend electrolytes first thing when you wake up in the morning to help you wake up, right? And then at nighttime, making sure that you have a wind down routine. And there's really fundamental things that everybody can do that are important, such as like sleeping in a colder, darker room. That's going to help you fall asleep better. That's going to prevent you having nightmares. You can take an Epsom salt bath or take some magnesium at bedtime. That's going to help you wind down and fall asleep, making sure that you're not, watching TV or on your phone right before, getting all of the different blue lights in your bedroom, cover those up, right? So you're not exposed to that. Sometimes it can go a bit deeper than that, but these are the fundamentals that I recommend. Mm-hmm. And that is really part of I talk about 15 different safety signals that we want to send our bodies when we think about why we have all these symptoms and why we're not feeling well, is because essentially we're sensing the world is hostile. And so we want to send the body more safety signals to let the body know that it's safe. You could relax, you can get some rest. And sleep is such an important safety signal, as is being aligned with our circadian balance. This is going to let you know that it's safe, right? So you're going to you get better sleep, your body's going to heal, right? Mm-hmm. That's when we do most of our brain and body healing, is when we're asleep.
Absolutely. Okay. So what are some of the other maybe top 2, 3, 4 biggies in your system of the adrenal transformation protocol?
Blood sugar balance is going to be really important. So making sure that you're eating throughout the day, you're eating enough food, you're eating foods that aren't inflammatory to you. So inflammation from foods or from even not getting enough food can be a signal to your body that you're not safe, right? And so we're eating really, really good food throughout the day. We're hydrating with electrolytes. That's another safety signal to make sure that you are well hydrated, right? Another safety signal is going to be focused on restoring key levels of specific nutrients that might become deficient when we're super stressed out. The B vitamins, vitamin C are some of the nutrients that we tend to burn through, as well as magnesium. I do recommend getting on some mitochondrial support. That can be very, very helpful. And then there's this whole thing about like your lifestyle and what are you actually doing in your day-to-day life to feel good. And a big part of it that I really love to focus on is like pleasurable activities throughout the day. So doing things that just you enjoy. And I know it sounds so like basic, but it works really, really well. I know I saw somebody saying like, I actually tried relaxing, and I tried eating healthy, and I tried getting some rest. And I hate to tell you this, but this actually worked, right? I actually feel better.
You know what? This is, for me, this is what it's all about. And we need to recognize the reality that over the 80% of the modern disease burden in the West are diseases of nutrition and lifestyle. They're not, they're driven by problems with our diet, problems with too much sedentary lifestyles, problems with circadian rhythm and sleep, problems with chronic stress, problems with toxicity, problems with these cigarette smoking and drinking are I mean, and yet we, as health geeks like you and I are, and people who are in sort of the natural health, functional medicine space, there is a tendency among practitioners to constantly try to, I would say, like to try to one up one another in terms of their complicated systems and how deep they're going into the biochemistry of specific diseases. But the reality is 80% of the disease burden is driven by nutrition and lifestyle issues. And so going into like these very complicated biochemistry explanations, and if only you take this substance and this amount, then it will alter this chain of da 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 da. It's like, okay, but if you don't address the foundational nutrition and lifestyle strategies, you're not going to get a profound change. And I think so many people right now are missing the basics. And there's also a strong tendency, I think, for people in the general public, because they've heard these things so many times, like, oh, I'm supposed to exercise and I'm supposed to eat right and eat good nutritious foods and eat more salads and stuff like that, and eat more protein. People have a tendency subjectively to delude themselves into thinking that they are living an extremely healthy lifestyle when they're actually not. Like, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people who are living a very typical lifestyle, eating plenty of processed foods, not doing much exercise, who will tell me how healthy their lifestyle is and how they do so much exercise and how they eat such a great diet and da da da. I mean, we have to not underestimate the power of self-delusion, and this is something that we're all, as humans, extraordinarily susceptible to making ourselves believe we're being much more productive than we are, doing much more work than we are, being much healthier, having much healthier habits than we are, eating much fewer calories than we really are, right? Like we have this tendency to do that. And all of this is to say that I think the basics of optimizing nutrition and lifestyle, and doing that on an extremely high level where you really do those foundational nutrition and lifestyle habits really well, is where it's at. And that's where most of the healing will happen.
It's really incredible. My program is only 4 weeks long. And so by week 1, I usually would have, and I started this off with, I started doing these lifestyle changes because I was a sleep deprived mom, and I just was exhausted. And I was like, what else can I do other than take hormones and quit coffee? And obviously I can't sleep all night. So I wanted to find out some things I could do. And I felt significantly better, right, in just a couple of weeks. And so I decided to pilot it with my group of people with Hashimoto's. And we've had over 3,000 people take the program now that got turned into this book. And, 80% of them feel better. So by week 2 and week 1, I get all these questions about like, should I get on hydrocortisone? Should I do this adrenal test? Should I do this test? What should I do? And it's all like very fancy stuff, right? And then by week 2, they're like, oh, wow, I actually am doing this, like just stepping outside, and I'm drinking your adrenal kickstart drink that supports healthy cortisol production throughout the morning. And I'm doing adult coloring books, right? So I have a beautiful adult coloring picture in the inside of the book and inside of the program. And they're like, and you know what? I don't feel anxious. And I'm doing the diet. And my anxiety was like at an 8, and now it's like at a 2. And it's usually like week 2 and 3. The first week everybody's like super anxious, super overwhelmed. And then by like week 4, they're like, my libido's back. My husband wants to thank you, send you a package. And it's just amazing what happens. You can transform your whole body with like really simple little safety signals. And yes, nutrition is fundamental, making sure you're hydrating. I only use 6 different supplements throughout this program. I know whenever I work with people, they're like, and here is my bag of supplements with everything that I'm on. And you're like, well, this kind of, interacts with this, and this could suppress your levels and this could boost your levels. And you're just like, okay. And so it's very foundational. It's very fundamental. It doesn't require testing. It doesn't require hormones. And it'll make you feel better when you just do these fundamental things. And yes, there's some people that may need to go after chronic infections. They may need to go after toxins. But when your body is in a very rested state, it's going to be able to fight infections better naturally. And your detox pathways are going to work better as well. So it's just very foundational to put your body into this, I guess I like to call it rest and digest state versus being constantly in a state of like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? And it's a big shift that I see in people, and it's beautiful to witness every time.
Absolutely. Dr. Wentz, I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to reconnect with you after 5 long years of not having you on the podcast. I've missed you terribly, but it's wonderful to have you back on. And I'm so glad that you're coming out with a new book. Tell people where they can get your book, and is it an online program as well that's related to that? Or is it the book? Let people know everything that you've got going on.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me back. I've missed you too. I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't go back to work until my son started sleeping, because it just wasn't kind to to make myself work all day and be up all night, right? And so I'm back, and I'm excited to be back. So my book can be found on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, wherever fine books are sold, The Adrenal Transformation Protocol. I also have a quick start guide. It's an ABC guide, just some of the basic foundational things you can do. And you could find it at thyroidpharmacist.com/ABC. And that'll go over some of the B vitamins, vitamin C, as well as magnesium, how to use that, some of the lifestyle changes that we talked about. I have a little quick guide for people to do that on their own. And then I can always send people information about when we're doing our next live adrenal program. So we're only doing it probably once this year in June. So if you wanted to get more information about that, please sign up with me.
Okay. We will we'll set links up to all of that information that you just mentioned on the show notes for this page, which I will set up at, what URL should I use? theenergyblueprint.com/ I probably have already used Isabella. So maybe I will use, I don't know. I might also have used Adrenal something. That's the challenge here. Geez. All right. I don't know what I'll use.
Isabella.
Let's do ATP book. ATP book. So the energyblueprint.com/ ATP book. Okay. And we will put everything, links to everything you just mentioned, or people can go directly to your site, Thyroid Pharmacist, for more information on that. Dr. Wentz, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure. I look forward to our next conversation and hopefully seeing you and your husband in person sometime soon.
Oh my gosh, you too. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at The Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next